I just noticed Venetia's hand was up.
That was really good. But I'm really new to teaching. I'm just like doing my 500-hour one. Is there any way I can get hold of like the notes for that? Because I was trying to do some scribing, but it was really fast. And I also wanted to know, can we use this for business English? So I'm really interested in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd recommend that you upgrade to the Gallery Pro, and then you have access to everything. And you can watch it, and then you can take as many notes as you like. That's really interesting, Venetia. Watching it back, I thought to myself, my goodness, I seem to be talking a million miles an hour there.
I talk really fast, but I like to take notes so that I can look at it again. But I was only introduced to it this morning by a lady called, let me find her name, Justine, I think it was. Yeah, Janice introduced me this morning to it, so it's my first time on this.
Fantastic. Well, you're very welcome, and hopefully we'll see you again to come back again. Dylan, you work with business clients fairly frequently, is that right?
I do, yes. I do a lot of work with business clients. And in answer to the question, I think certainly sentence stress is something I focus on a lot. You know, if someone's in a negotiation and you don't want to be really blunt or really direct, if you say, that's an interesting proposition. You know, it's very important that you stress the right word to keep the conversation open, keep the negotiation relatively amicable and friendly. So I think we can use that a lot in business English classes, definitely.
Yeah, I think when we're teaching, particularly in business English, we might often cover hedging language or couching language, and again, I think that's where the intonation is often more important than the actual words that you're saying. You know, like how you're saying something can sort of soften the blow, can't it? Or, you know, trying to find other ways of saying no without saying no directly. Are you working online, Venetia? Or are you in a physical space with students?
I'm not doing anything yet. I'm still studying.
Great. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. I have got a couple of my current CELTs on the call at the moment, which is really lovely. Thank you guys for supporting me. I definitely think it's really important to do, you know, a program of structured study around teaching methodology, you know, before you go into actually teaching, because there's such a wealth of information out there that it's important that you're able to make kind of, you know, sensible decisions about what's going to work with your learners and what's not. You know, on one hand, great, so much there in terms of online resources and also YouTube videos. But the negative side of that is that I certainly can't keep up to date with all content ever. So people ask me, oh, can you recommend this or can you recommend that? A lot of the stuff that I tend to recommend is stuff that I know is reliable, that may now be slightly outdated because I can't keep abreast of, you know, all of the current people who are out there and offering content. But Gallery Teachers is a curated space. You know, it has qualified people like Dylan, myself, you know, other CELTA trainers, other very experienced teachers. So I've got no hesitation in recommending any of the webinars and the workshops on Gallery because I know they've been curated by people who've got, you know, a standing in the industry. So I'd say that was a good investment, Venetia, to invest in that, and then you've got access to everything. I also did a webinar on drilling, which again is a long forgotten technique, but we have that in common. Is that right, Dylan? You're also a driller.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about, actually, drilling. And I think many people who go through initial teacher training courses like CELTA or Trinity Team, they're often discouraged from doing too much drilling. And I think it's something that we can use really effectively with all types of learners. So I thought I'd ask, do you have any special drilling techniques or any drilling activities that you really enjoy doing and find really productive in the classroom?
You need to watch my webinar, Dylan. It was great, all about drilling. I definitely think that drilling is really important. And when Gabby was chatting earlier about, you know, pronunciation can be a really useful filler, I try and get pronunciation popped in at several stages in the lesson so that the students don't kind of feel a bit overwhelmed by drilling. And, you know, drilling only needs to be like 90 seconds, you know, maximum 2 minutes. But if you do it sort of like twice in a lesson, or maybe 3 times if you can. It just really helps the memory of the sound and the words stick. So I mentioned in that video we just about what I call substitution drilling. So sticking to the target language, but then sort of like changing the end bit, if you like. I always think of it as like, one of those fruit machines where you've got like, the rolling lemons and the bells and the sevens and all the rest of it. So you press hold on your target language and then you offer your prompts, and the learners can just use the prompts to help them produce entire utterances. So present perfect is a perfect example of that. If we wanted to practice the question, have you ever been to? We would teach the chunk, have you ever been to? And then all we'd have to do is give them the prompt, London. And then the students would come back with, have you ever been to London? And then I would say New York. And they'd come out with, have you ever been to New York or Miami? So I think substitution drilling is a really useful way of giving the learners lots of practice at every level, I think, Gabby. I definitely think, for me personally, I think drilling is important at all the levels. I would probably do a lot more at the lower level. For me, it's called drilling for a reason. I make the analogy of like going to the dentist. If you need a filling, he's not going to tentatively poke your tooth once or twice. He's going to be drilling. That's what we need to do with language. So it needs to be, regular, and it needs to be intense, but it also needs to be varied and fun. So I would introduce chunking and drilling right from even the zero beginners. When I was working in Libya on British Council project, not only was I working with the Libyan English teachers, but I was also working with some of the postgraduate students, and some of them were zero beginners, which means they have no English at all whatsoever, which is quite unusual these days because most people are exposed to English through movies or through music. But, my experience of teaching beginners is not to teach things like the alphabet, because that's not helpful. I want my students to get functional fast. I would teach them functional phrases like, for example, can I have? And then you can substitute things like a bus ticket, a cup of tea, a ham sandwich. And now I'm good to go in 3 different situations. If somebody can produce, can I have a bus ticket? They can move around an area. Can I have a cup of tea? They can get themselves refreshed. Can I have a sandwich? They can get themselves fed. So can I have is a useful chunk, and then substituting in, various nouns. Same thing in classroom English. Can I have a pencil? Can I have some help? So just a couple of really well-placed functional phrases right from absolute beginners can give the students, a bit of freedom and flexibility in the way they communicate. So I think that drilling is really important, right from the very, very basic levels. What about you, Dylan? What's your experience of the higher levels?
Well, with the lower levels, I think it's really interesting that you use the phrase "can I have," because I often teach even slightly more polite variants like "could I have" to very low level learners, or "I would like," as opposed to "I want." So I don't think we should be too afraid of maybe introducing some areas of some chunks of grammar. If we consider something like a modal would or could, even with low level learners, I think these are small chunks. You don't have to grammarize them. You can just think this is a phrase that's going to be very useful. It's polite, so you can use it and you won't cause offense in a lot of these situations in which you find yourself. So I think we can be a bit more flexible with what we decide to actually teach regarding chunks with lower level learners. They're very high frequency chunks.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really key point that you just made about it doesn't have to be grammarized. I don't think it helps a zero beginner to know terminology like present simple or auxiliary verb. How is that going to help them, a cup of tea or catch a train? So obviously, we can introduce that kind of language later on as they become more confident and they're able to read. And certainly when they're in looking at course books, they'll be exposed to terminology because all course books will use things like auxiliary, present simple, present continuous. But I think like taking a functional approach is really, really helpful for learners rather than overwhelming them with technical terminology.
Yeah. And regarding the question about higher level learners, what I find is that if you do the drilling at the lower levels, they reach a point, probably sort of intermediate, where they're able to actually look at a phrase and they're able to identify which words, for example, are stressed. So this is where they start cognitively thinking about it. And at this point, they can take a lot more responsibility for their own learning. And then you don't have to do so much explicit drilling. You can get them organising drilling among themselves, which I think is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think I really agree about that learner autonomy. And again, I try to encourage autonomy, from as soon as it's practically possible, because you want your learners to be able to function outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom, which is even more important if they're, learning English in a non-English speaking country. If they can have autonomy and take responsibility for, doing their own research or, finding out how things are without a teacher present, it's only going to serve them well in the future, where they can then start to put things together, as you say, and analyze things or have a natural feel for things as well. I'm sure you've met students at intermediate, upper intermediate level, and they know the right answer, and then if you try and go why, they're like, I don't know, it just sounds right. And that's great because they're using that kind of innate knowledge of their language rather than the sort of the grammatical terminology necessarily.
And I think I use that term advisedly, but fixing problems with word stress, sentence stress, and intonation much more difficult at high levels because they've got that fluency. And it's really frustrating if they have to work on their intonation and it holds them back, and they know they can actually produce this very decent language in other respects in terms of the grammar and lexis. But they're going to struggle to make themselves understood because the intonation or the sentence stress is not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really understand.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to make sure that you're not neglecting pronunciation. I think, a lot of candidates on training courses, feel a bit funny about, modeling pronunciation and then controlling the students to get the language back at them. But my experience from speaking to learners is they really benefit hugely from pronunciation practice, and a lot of them really enjoy it. And I think you're right. If you lay that foundation early on, then they have got much more facility with the sort of sound, with the gradations of language as they kind of move up through the levels, and they don't have to do extra work on pronunciation and intonation when they've been exposed to it right from the get-go.
Okay. There's a question, I think, are business English usually high levels? Well, in my experience, they're usually sort of B1 and above. I do have some learners who are a bit lower, but generally they have kind of a reasonably decent level of competence B1. You get a lot who are B2, C1, and they're quite conversational, or they often have very good knowledge of their particular sector or their job, but they struggle when it comes to things like making small talk or more sort of fatted language, language to build relationships.
I think, again, that's where stress can be really useful, word stress and sentence stress, particularly in small talk, sounding interested in
Yes.
other people in conversation, simple things like if you're around a dinner table and you notice somebody's being a bit quieter, so using your intonation to encourage a you, or what do you think? So just little conversational gambits, little helpful chunks, and then using those skills to kind of grease the wheels of business, I think.
Exactly. Sorry.
No worries. What about other people? Any comments or questions on any of the activities you saw from the word and sentence stress? Don't be shy, be brave. Now's your time to ask questions. We talked a little bit, didn't we, Dylan, earlier about different kinds of Englishes, English as an international language.
Yeah, that was my question. You said native speakers were attuned to specific stress patterns. But as we all know now, I'm not sure what the percentage is, but probably 80% of conversations are between non-native or L2 speakers of English. So to what extent now can intonation be taught? Do you think intonation is changing? Do you think there's a kind of an international intonation now with maybe not so many of the features of British English or American English?
Language is dynamic. I think language is always changing. And I think there are also trends in language, that Australian upswing at the end of sentences that was fashionable for a while, and so those things dip in and out of language, I think. And I think, you you can make yourself understood, even if your accent and your intonation is not, whatever standard British English is. And I'm always really anti saying things like standard British English, because what does that even mean? Across the UK, we've got lots of different accents, from down in Bournemouth where I am, across to Manchester, Liverpool, Scotland. I did a webinar with Nikki Partridge. We talked about Welsh. There are just so many different accents, and therefore intonation is going to differ. And that's, I think that's a great thing for sure. But I definitely think that in terms of word stress and shifting stress, I think it is useful if learners can see patterns and understand patterns, because it can be challenging to compensate for an accent and the wrong stress, and extra other problems on top. So I still think as a teacher, there's definitely some value in making sure that the learners are mindful of where stress goes, and being able to recognize, things like the little apostrophe looking thing when they're using online dictionary, so they can, again, be autonomous in figuring out how new words sound for themselves. But I think we're all a bit more, we'll be much more forgiving of, different accents, different pronunciations. That's just part and parcel of living in a global community, I think.
Yeah. There's another question about how we can make it fun.
I make everything fun, Gabby. What are you talking about? I don't even know what you mean by that. So for me, I think the kinesthetic thing is quite fun. I like the fact that, what was it, Venetia just talking about, using actual objects. If any of you have seen the webinar from Anna Kukia, she's a Cuisenaire rods fan. So, using the stress, using Cuisenaire rods to show stress can be helpful. I'm a big fan of the finger technique. That can be quite fun for learners to have a go at as well. How about you, Dylan? Have you got any suggestions?
Yeah, I used to do something which was like silent conversation. So you had two people who stood maybe 2 meters away from each other, and they had a very simple conversation, just mouthing the words in a very exaggerated way. Like, for example, and it works surprisingly well, and people can often guess what the other person is saying, and it really helps them with word stress and sentence stress, I think.
Nice.
And I mean, when I do Trinity TESOL training courses, when I want to introduce the whole idea of sentence stress, I just have two sentences where person A and person B. Person A says, "I love you," and person B says, "But I don't love you." And they just explore what happens when you change the stress. So "I love you" is very different to "I love you," or "I love you" is obviously "I love you," not like. And then the other person, "But I don't love you," suggests that there's someone else who's in love with it. "But I don't love you," because it's your best friend I'm in love with. So it really kind of helps them explore how just changing sentence can completely affect the meaning that you're trying to convey.
Okay, and questions that people wanted to throw at us?
We did chat about technology and using AI and sort of text-to-speech apps and everything like that. And I wonder if we can incorporate them when we're teaching word stress, sentence stress, and intonation.
Yeah, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I'm playing around at the moment with something called SpeechLo, which is it just allows you to create very short dialogues with artificial intelligence voices. And it's surprisingly good. It's certainly not perfect. And it really, the intonation, often very flat intonation. But things like sentence stress, you can actually play around with it and actually do an artificial intelligence recording with specific words stressed. So that can be used just to create these little texts, I think, that then we can play audio text and play to our learners, and so they can get extra exposure. Because I think it can be quite difficult finding resources for working on things like stress and intonation.
I think using smartphones as well, the voice recording app that most people have on smartphones is something that students can usefully do as well. They can hear themselves trying to maybe practice reading something in a flat, restrictive monotonous voice versus adding in the stress, playing with contrastative stress, like we mentioned, with little dialogues, role-playing dialogues. And I think for students being able to hear that back, play it back, they can maybe hear the difference and think about ways they can work on improving their own relationship to stress and intonation. So I think technology can definitely play a part in that, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the little reflective questions, and I'd love to hear from attendees as well about integrating. How do you integrate word and sentence stress into your daily teaching, and how do you integrate word and sentence stress into daily teaching? For me, I think it's just the natural part of what I do these days. If I'm eliciting a word and the right kind of word comes back, but the stress is wrong, we'll work on it immediately. Or, if I'm teaching a word, then obviously once we've established meaning, then how the word looks and how the word sounds is just a natural part of what I believe students need to know in order to truly be able to know and then use a word. So for me, it's just a reflective part of what I do naturally. How about you, Dylan?
Yeah, exactly the same. I mean, almost every time I introduce a new word or a chunk, then I will probably either explore the pronunciation, the features, the stress pattern. I like with high level learners, I think often you give them the chance. So they try, if it sounds fine, great, you can move on. If you make a mistake, then a quick correction. Doesn't take long. I think most people appreciate it because they understand the importance of word and sentence stress. So it doesn't take long. I think you need to just remember to actually explain the correct version and also get them to have a try. Often we forget the last step and we just say, no, it should be pronounced like this, and then we move on.
Yeah, that's really key and ties into the second question. And actually, I was delivering on error to my CELTA trainees last night. So question 2 is, do you think your students care about how they sound when they're speaking in English, and why do they care? So my experience is that most of them are really keen to want to do better, and so they welcome error correction. They want it a lot more than maybe I might be willing to give it. If you're having a conversation with somebody, I think it's really important to make sure that you're spending time on the message as well as the kind of the pernickety little bits and pieces. As long as the message can be understood, maybe you might choose to let a couple of pronunciation errors slide. But I definitely think that students do want to be clear and want to be understood, because I think I think a lot of certainly my experience of adult learners is a sense of professional pride, isn't it? You want to feel like you're being good at something. What about your clients that you work with?
Yeah, exactly the same. I think they definitely, with adult clients, if they understand that this might be something that affects their communicative competence, so they're very aware of that. They generally take classes in order to, so they're quite happy to get some feedback. Obviously, they don't want to be corrected for every tiny mistake, and you've got to make that decision about when you think something might affect communication. And there's a good question about, do you correct intonational stress errors immediately or use delayed correction? I said about you, I use both. I vary.
Yeah, for sure. I think if it's appropriate, then immediacy is useful because it's right there and then in that moment. Sometimes as well, if I'm in a learning teaching situation and I'm working with somebody one-to-one, I can tell from the tentative way they give me a word that they want to have the correction there and then. But if the message is more important, then I might choose to let it slide and then come back to it at the end of the conversation, perhaps. We also talked, didn't we, Dylan, about using the chat box sometimes to help correct.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the benefits of online teaching. You can correct quite discreetly. And you just mentioned to your learner, okay, I'm going to write a few things in the chat box, so just keep an eye on it. And then that means that they can maintain the flow, keep on talking, and get corrected. And then perhaps you can come back to it at the end. A lot of people sub-vocalize as well with correction.
Yeah, definitely. I tend to use the spots and circles in a chat box as well. If somebody's mispronounced something, I can just quickly type in the word and then show what the stress should look like. And often if the student is keeping an eye on that, they might actually go back and just self-correct, or as you say, kind of like sub-vocalize it when they've seen it and take it in. But I think you mentioned earlier, Dylan, that going back and making sure the students get a go. So not just correcting the error, but maybe drawing their attention to the error and then giving the opportunity to the learner just to kind of get their mouths around, the shape of the sounds or the way the stress is, or, if it's a polysyllabic word, it might need 3 or 4 goes, or it becomes a little bit easier in the mouth. Sometimes sounds can literally be a mouthful, can't they? And then depending on the L1 of the student, if they're not used to moving their mouths in such weird that some of our vowel sounds require, the ooh, there's lots of kind of facial movement, jaw movement required. So just even modeling the single sound before you put it back in the word, and then before you use that word in a chunk, and then you put that chunk in a sentence. So I think all of those play a really important part when you're delivering word and sentence stress, right from sounds to words to chunks to sentences. And I think, yes, then a mixture of both immediate and delayed correction is probably the most appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are some learners, certainly when you work one-to-one, some learners who really struggle to communicate and formulate sentences, either because they're very nervous or they're anxious or they're perfectionists or for whatever reason. You might want to be very wary of giving direct correction on their pronunciation if they're really struggling to get the words out. But that's the relationship you have with the learner over time, and gradually build up their confidence, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, because sometimes even if a student says, "Well, I really want you to correct me," I'm still really mindful about picking my battles. If I did go in and correct every single error, we really wouldn't get very far at all. And I don't think that's very helpful, because, building confidence, building trust, building rapport, and also, does the error interfere with communication? If they can be understood, then maybe that's an error that we can let slide. But if it's a high frequency error, then there'll be other opportunities that it crops up that will, give you the chance to correct at a later stage. So maybe not everything has to be dealt with there and then, because it might come up again and you can correct it the second or the third time round. Venetia, lip speaking. I'm not exactly sure I know what that is. Was talking about earlier, when you just kind of say a conversation without actually making noises.
Yeah, we do it for people who are hard of hearing or deaf, so that I would sit and repeat what you're saying to my person, but slightly behind, so they understand it completely, so they read my lips.
Okay, great. So you should be absolutely brilliant at modeling and drilling then.
I think so.
Yeah, not afraid. I mean, I say this to my CELTA candidates, don't be afraid of making a mug of yourself. It just overemphasizing something can just be really helpful for the learners to see something really clearly. Especially if they are weird vowel sounds that don't exist in other languages. The sound is quite a tricky one. If you're trying to focus on words like girl and earth and worm. I normally have, the mouth shape and sound backed up with kind of silly story or prompt. So I imagine I'm just walking along and I've stepped in something disgusting. What's my reaction? So I get my learners to practice stepping in something disgusting, so we all practice going, because you can't make that vowel sound if you're smiling. That's a totally different sound. So the students need to have some ability in the shape and in the face so they can actually be heard and understood a bit more clearly. So yeah, lip speaking then. So just practicing moving your mouth would be really good training for stuff like that. That's fantastic. And Gabby says, yeah, pronunciation should be visible. I think so too. Particularly online as well, often sound is maybe a bit delayed. So if you're good at lip reading, then you've got an advantage. For sure. Ooh, okay, that's a lovely question. So, I mean, just picking up on something that was in the webinar. So what the students can do themselves is, using online dictionaries, using the little, the loudspeaker or microphones. It depends. I mean, there are some apps where there is a microphone next to the loudspeaker, so they can listen and then they can record and then they can listen and compare. So I think that, those things are really helpful to encourage autonomy, and to help the student kind of like, finesse some of the points that they might want to work on their pronunciation. I don't know if you guys have got other suggestions about things that students can do, or if you've been an English language student yourself, what kind of things did you use to try to improve your pronunciation, and your word and sentence stress when you were around the teacher?
I mean, even something like YouTube, I think, obviously you can slow things down on YouTube, so they could watch a very short YouTube video and just sort of use the shadowing technique where they hear someone say something, a short phrase, pause, try to repeat it. Because you can play around, obviously, with the speed, I think that helps it become a bit more accessible to learners, and they can see and really identify which words are stressed. So I think there's lots of things you can do now.
Yeah, but just like triggered something about, TED Talks. You can choose like a 6-minute TED Talk, just something short. The audio scripts are also available online, so helping the students recognize chunking. So, being able to listen to the conversation and then follow and read, and then they'll be able to see which kinds of content words get the stress, and then which words sentence, are almost missing. And then they'll notice, things like the ofs, the ands, your prepositions, your articles. They're the kinds of things that don't get given much stress. And I'm sure in course books, there's already activities like that where after they've heard an audio and dealt with the comprehension and the new vocabulary, there may well then be an exercise on pronunciation where the learner is accessing the tape script, and then being shown about, 2 or 3 sentences in particular, shown about linking, often, how vowel and consonant sounds run into each other, chunking, this kind of thing. So I think course books are getting better at kind of, doing a bit more and encouraging autonomy. But yeah, the fact that our thing like TED Talks and YouTube is really helpful. Oh, Lisa, Netflix with subtitles. Does she watch with English subtitles, or does she watch in English with Greek subtitles? Can we give Lisa the power to speak?
Hi, Susie.
Hiya.
Hi. Yeah, she loves watching things like Friends or Netflix is lovely, and something so it's interesting, and then she can really, and watching the subtitle and then reading the subtitles really helps. So that's great because she's motivated, she's into it. So I think that's a really good thing. Just get students motivated into something. Helps so much.
If they've got like an area of interest, they could find something on Netflix, a documentary or whatever. But I'm interested, does she watch in Greek and read English subtitles, or does she switch it the other way around?
No, she watches the English with English subtitles. It's a bit odd, but yeah, so it's not Greek at all. So
yeah, but Netflix is great for that, isn't it? Because you can change the way that you receive things. And I definitely am guilty. People have been going on about games, so I jumped on the Squid Game bandwagon on Netflix, but I chose to listen in English rather than have the Korean with the English subtitles. Sometimes I'm just tired and I just want things just to be coming in a bit more easily than having to make the effort to read. But I definitely think that subtitles are really, really, really useful, because again, it's about recognizing, isn't it, the sound versus what the word is. And also, I don't know if it's the same. Certainly, it was. I've noticed that sometimes, like what they say and what the subtitle is sometimes a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that helps a lot because you don't always get it. So sometimes it helps just to see both, and it just clarifies it. It's definitely helping. Yeah. But thanks so much, Susie, for today. It's really, really good.
Lovely to see you. Thanks for coming out, Lisa. I appreciate that. So watching BBC News with subtitles is another one. And I think, you do have the closed caption option available on the things that we watch online these days, which is a really great way to support, the international community, and, people who might have, visual impairment or be hard of hearing and something. So yeah, I definitely think that subtitles is a really helpful thing to be on the lookout for.
Susie, do you ever use, I don't know, for instance, Cuisinart rods or any I don't know, tools, physical tools when it comes to teaching word or sentence stress?
I used to when I was in a physical space, Hedy. I've got to be honest, online, I find it much more challenging. My colleague Anna, she's managed to get like some kind of bit of kit where, there's a camera. She could have the Cuisinart rods on the table, and then there's a camera above, and you can actually see this. So the physical manipulation of something can be really useful, and that's why I used to use it in a classroom. Again, thinking about learners who've got different preferences, being able to like use little blocks to be able to like manipulate stress and play with stress. Again, I think it makes it more memorable, more visual. It's good for your kinesthetic learners. So I used to, but I've got to be honest, online, not so much.
But I love your idea of using the circles. I call them bubbles. So when I tell my students that today we are going to bubble, they know what's coming.
Nice.
So
I love that. And then the oranges and plums, so actual real life bubbles. If you're bringing
things using objects to stress content words. So if you have them available, then that might be nice as well.
And I think those are useful activities as well, of like, giving students little sort of like, 4 or 6 line dialogues, getting them to listen to each other, saying the dialogues, and then identifying the stressed words, the content words. So putting the bubble or the Cuisinart rods or the oranges and plums, whatever it might be. So I think raising students' awareness and having them play. And I think play is a really important part of pronunciation, like it doesn't all have to be deadly serious. We're not always going to get everything right, and that's all right. That's absolutely fine. I mess up pronunciation all the time, especially if I'm speaking particularly quickly on that day. So I think telling students that they don't have to be 100% perfect 100% of the time, and just reassuring them, still earlier, most of the conversations they'll be having will be with other non-native speaking people, and so we're all going to make mistakes, and that's absolutely fine. You can still have effective communication.
I for instance, use I love pronunciation as an extension activity after, let's say, listening or any reading tasks, doesn't matter. I just take, let's say, a paragraph from a listening task. And so let's say we have a listening task on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday, I go back to class with this, where I take one paragraph from the text, and I remove, let's say, 4 or 5, let's say 4 words to start with. And instead, I just have the bubbles, instead. So content words that are important for the students to remember. And so I ask them first to read the complete paragraph, and then I give them the slip where some of the words have been substituted with the bubble and the stress pattern. And so they need to read the text with those. And then I have a second version where I add more words on top of those. So we have, let's say, 7 words removed, and you can only see the bubbles instead. So showing the number of syllables and the big circle showing where the stress is. And then we have version 3. So, and if they, become excited that, oh my God, really? So I just say, okay, so if we had version 2, it means that we have also what? Version 3, really? Okay, yes, that's version 3. And when there are, let's say, 9 words removed and substituted with the patterns, the bubbles. And then usually I prepare 4 versions, and it's just amazing how they become more aware of the words, how to pronounce that. They cannot see the words, so it will not confuse their brain. They don't want to say what they see, but the bubbles will guide them. So I love that.
Yeah.
And I have a question, Susie. Do you use exaggeration when when you do not want to give away where the stress is? And do you just say like, do you say banana or banana or banana? Do you use this?
Sometimes, yeah, I do. I try and get the students to do it as well, and see if the students can put in the wrong stress. And again, that's where your B1s and your B2s kind of go, oh no, that feels wrong. Doesn't sound right. So yeah, I've got a difficult relationship with giving bad models. I understand that can sometimes be really helpful for learners to recognize and correct, but also I'm really mindful as well about currently training on a CELTA course, and we try and tell them, don't put wrong things on the board, don't model wrong things, because you are the model that the learners are listening to. So I think if it's with an established class that I oh yes, absolutely. And I think that's the joy, isn't it, when you're working, in real time, and you see your learners, every day or 3 times a week. So that's quite different from, my trainees who've got 45 minutes, once a fortnight. So what they're being taught to do as best practice on a CELTA might be quite different from the reality of being in a class where you see people every day. So I think definitely wrong stress is fun when you've got that relationship with your learners. So yeah, that's a really nice idea. How about you, Dylan? Do you have a play with wrong stress?
Sorry, I have a tech issue. Yeah, I feel the same. I think certainly when you've got a good relationship with your students, you can play around a bit more, obviously. But also, I think when you're learning a bit about word stress and sentence stress, when you're a beginner teacher, then you don't want to play around with providing bad models, because actually can get very confusing in the moment, and you think, my God, how do I say, is it banana or banana or banana? You end up getting very confused yourself. So I think just for your own sanity, really.
Really, that is nice.
Wait a few years.
Really
when you start playing around with bad models.
It's true, because I think some beginner teachers do really struggle to hear stress sometimes. They might be, especially because when you're learning to analyze language in this whole new way that you have to on Trinity and CELTAs. You look at a word like pronunciation and go, is it pronunciation? Or pronunciations is a classic, because lots of people say pronunciation, and I've got to stop myself from correcting them, because I think
advertisement, yeah.
So I definitely think that, yeah, errors and wrong stress and all that kind of playing comes with time and practice and confidence. Yeah, for sure. I'm really interested, Shona, if you're willing, just to hear from you a little bit with the refugees and asylum seekers that you work with. Are you mindful about helping them with how they speak, intonation, stress, etc.? Is it just more about getting the message across?
Some of the refugees are very, very varied. Some of them are quite articulate, and some of them have very, very little English. But I think it's about getting the message across, really, especially at the beginning, because it's a whole new world. They're very confusion reigns. Glasgow's a place which it's got an accent all of its own. And I'm somebody who, although I'm Scots, I don't originally come from Glasgow, so I had to tune in, so to speak, to the accent. So I can imagine if you're coming from somewhere like Afghanistan or Pakistan, the confusion must be dreadful. But yeah, I think it's about getting the message across at the beginning, at least, so that they don't feel so apart from it, and everything is so new. They don't feel so apart from everything.
Yeah.
And I think as well, maybe it's a wee bit going off piste a wee bit about in a classroom, maybe finding somebody who is from the same country so that they can guide them as well, and maybe help them with the pronunciation as well, just to find how things work in that way.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point about being aware of your audience, and I think developing that rapport, developing trust, allowing the message to be the most
to get across. Yeah,
exactly. So working with asylum seekers and refugees, I think I'd be way less inclined to be heavily correcting, because you need to be mindful about the relationship that you want to develop in terms of trust if they're coming from from really difficult experiences. And yeah, it must be so interesting for for them to kind of like land in a new place and then have to manage with all of these strange sounds coming at them. So yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely think that picking your moments with correction and stress is important for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You want your students to come back. You want them to have a good experience, to think, okay, I can come back to this class next week and it's not going to be horrible, because I think approaching a class like that must be really difficult. It's and they might have tried 2 or 3 times before they even get into the classroom. So I think if you say it's not going to be too fearful, it's not going to be horrible, we're not going to be horrible to you, and just be friendly, and even if they're just sitting listening for a few times and then till they kind of get their feet, especially at the beginning. So I think, I don't think you need to go into the heavy duty grammar and pronunciation, at least not at the beginning anyway.
Agreed. And I think that's where, as Lisa mentioned as well, letting students watch movies or TV programs that they're already familiar with, as a way of just passively hearing language sounds naturally. So they're exposed to word and sentence stress, they're exposed to intonation, but without it being. So I definitely think those are the kinds of things that students can be supported with outside of the learning environment.
Yeah, and the idea of using L2 pronunciation models as well. So if you're Spanish and you have a Spanish friend you use, for example, they do have very clear pronunciation in English, and actually allowing them to work together, encouraging that. I mean, often we learn from our near peers, don't we? We often learn from people who are slightly better than us at doing something, and something like pronunciation. Someone from the same country or who speaks the same first language may be able to guide you into correcting something.
Yeah,